Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another free virtual Thursday presentation/tour with the Foss Waterway Seaport. I'm your guide for the evening, Chris Staudinger with Pretty Gritty Tours, and tonight's infotainment is brought to you by the generous sponsorship of course, Columbia Bank and Port of Tacoma. And they are the great topic of tonight. It's funny, I was thinking about this preemptively because I've done, I think, like 178 virtual tours now since the beginning of the pandemic. And in a way, each of them has been about Port of Tacoma. So to finally get to focus on this entity, this neighbor that is always there, always touching on the destiny of Tacoma is really exciting. I want you to think of Port of Tacoma, if you can, as the great engine. And as a classic car city, this shouldn't be a stretch. But beneath the hood of Tacoma, constantly purring, meticulously moving, is the Port of Tacoma. And from the very beginning of Tacoma, it has been there in one form or another. Now, while the official Port of Tacoma, as we know it today, was established in 1918, the whole reason that people settled this area and made this the city of destiny was because of Tacoma's proximity to Commencement Bay, which is an exceptionally deep water port. Naturally, it required no dredging for the majority of it, though dredging has been done to certain waterways to accommodate larger ships over the history of this area. It was this beautiful, perfectly packaged geographical masterpiece in which you could get any ship into Commencement Bay, and then you could bring the train right down onto the tide flat, allowing for easy shipment between rails and sails, giving us so much of the last 100+ years of Tacoma's history. So let's crack this case open right now and take a look at it, because like a great engine in a beautiful car or truck, it's something that not a lot of people think about. It's something that operates hidden beneath the hood, and you consider it when things are going well or if things aren't. But other than that, it's not something that, unless you're into cars, you really spend a lot of time focusing on. So I'm excited to introduce you guys tonight to Port of Tacoma, and hopefully I can guide you through this experience seamlessly. I do want to give a tremendous amount of thanks to both the Foss Waterway Seaport and Port of Tacoma, and of course, senior communications consultant Rod Kuhn, who graciously walked me through the in-depth history of Port of Tacoma. So let's dive in, shall we? So if you live in Tacoma, or really Pierce County, Puget Sound area, you have some familiarity with the Port of Tacoma. It is that massive stretch down there on the waterfront, and there's some mystery to it because there's about 5,000 acres of tide flat zone down there on the Puyallup River in between northeast Tacoma and central Tacoma. And of those 5,000 acres, only about 2,400 are actually owned by Port of Tacoma. And when it started as a port down there, it was only 240 acres. So kind of unraveling what is Port of Tacoma and what was down near Port of Tacoma is part of that mystery of what makes this a big thing. But it was created by Pierce County citizens, like I said, in 1918, and it is now one of the largest container ports in North America and one of the top 50 container ports in the world. I don't think I can possibly stress enough just how grand this place is. Let's see if I can give you guys a little look at it here really quick. So, like I said, it started out as 240 acres. It's now 10 times larger than that at 2,400 acres. And look at all the shipping that goes on down here. Each year, the port handles, I think, about 9 to 13 million tons of cargo, which, if you're curious, that translates to more than $25 billion worth of commerce for the state of Washington. And the major imports here include automobiles, electronics, and toys, while our major exports are grain and then forest and agricultural products. And if you've been down to the waterfront at any point, you've probably noticed some things like the massive grain towers down there, or the large amount of trains that come through Tacoma. And really what I love about the city is that it has maintained its legacy of rails to sails. We are still very much a main port because of our proximity to the railroad and a deep water port. And so we'll get grain and shipments from as far away as the Midwest that then go out on their global journey from the Port of Tacoma. So it's pretty exciting to still have that here today. When you're looking at Port of Tacoma right now, port activities are related to more than 43,000 jobs in Pierce County alone. And that's 113,000 approximately jobs within Washington state. So they continue to be one of our biggest employers for the area. And it's impressive because it's not the only port in Washington state. In fact, if you look at it, and we'll talk a little bit about what actually a port is in a second here, but there are 70 public ports in the state of Washington. But ours is unique for so many reasons, not only because it is located really in the heart of Washington, if you look at it on a map in a lot of ways, but it's a gateway for a lot of places, including Asia, but also Alaska. And in fact, Port of Tacoma has the nickname Gateway to Alaska because it handles, I've seen a couple numbers here, but anywhere from 70 to 80% of all waterborne traffic commerce moving from the lower 48 up to Alaska. And that's really huge when you think about it, because if you're going to take anything up to Alaska, it would be difficult to do it by truck when you think about that. I don't know if anyone's ever taken the drive up through Canada to our wayward cousin up north, Alaska there, but I don't highly recommend it. The most efficient way to get something up to Alaska or vice versa is by ship. And that has often been the case. Really, the reason for Seattle's prominence as a major city is because of the great flux of people that came down out of the Yukon and were exchanging that gold that they acquired up there for goods and services, or then sending it outwards from there. And Port of Tacoma and the city of Tacoma benefited from that as well. So, stuff coming out of the Yukon or Alaska has often been part of the legacy and story of Tacoma's prominence in the area. And it continues to this day. In fact, you could make the argument even greater than previously. And there are still plans from the Port of Tacoma to expand outwards. And what's really exciting about Port of Tacoma for me is their connection to the community. It is something that was established by the citizens of Pierce County. It is something that has a proud tradition of unionized longshore labor. And it, as an entity, as the Port of Tacoma, has always had a strong hand in giving back environmentally to the area and making sure that there is something here. So let's get all into that. But port, what is a port? Because like I said, there are over 70, I believe 75 official ports in the state of Washington, in 33 of our 39 counties. So you can look at it here on the map. Blue is a countywide port district. Brown is less than countywide port district. And then the light blue is a non-port district area. But you can consider a lot of things ports. Actual marine terminals, yes, but also railroads and airports. It's just a point where shipping comes in and out. And so especially up the Columbia River, there are several port districts where, barges can come down the Columbia carrying that grain and then moving it out of Eastern Washington globally from there, generally on the railroad. But of the big ports, obviously Port of Tacoma is super, super prominent. And I'm going to make the argument, I don't want to start any fights, but the most important to the story of Washington state. Some fun facts for you guys, for those who are deeply curious in this. Ports created by citizens, enabled by state legislation, and are not part of city or county government. And that's kind of a big thing, is when that legislation changed, allowing the people to create a port through their own power here. The first time that this came up was in 1912, and it got slapped down. but I'm getting ahead of myself here. Let me introduce you briefly to the sort of story of the Port of Tacoma. So here she is today, but we had much more modest beginnings. Tacoma has always been a port town. I think if you go far enough back, 1868 is probably when you can put the first definitive stamp on Tacoma being a port town. And it started with a lumber mill. Nicholas Dellin, actually before Job Carr came to the area, came out and set up a lumber mill in the area. And they get the big ticket for shipping when they were shipping lumber down to San Francisco. Then in the later 1860s, 1868, a Danish sea captain by the name of Charles Hansen turned that mill into an even bigger production, and then gets their first international trade in 1871 when the Hansen Company starts shipping lumber to Peru on French ships. And that sort of begins Tacoma's love affair with international shipping. And like I said, it was because you could get a tall ship right up to the waterfront there. And then originally you could just slide trees down the steep hills, sort of in old Tacoma, bring them into the mill, right from the mill, which was on the water, onto a ship, and then bon voyage around the world. And even the Foss Waterway Seaport, constructed in 1901, is part of this rich legacy of Tacoma being a port town, because rails to sails there. If you've seen the Foss Waterway building, literally the rail line came right up to the side of that warehouse there, and the ships were docked on the other side. So longshore workers could take stuff from the train onto the ship, or vice versa, and just move whatever it was, grain, lumber, goods, from one point to the next incredibly easily. But there was no sort of unified approach to this. Each of these areas was owned by a private company, and that was getting outrageous at some point, because you see early Tacoma here, after it's selected to be the terminus for the railroad in 1873, blows up. The announcement is made, and then suddenly the population of Tacoma surges from just north of 1,000 people to 36,000 people in 10 years. You think we have a housing dilemma right now? Imagine Tacoma at the time struggling just to keep up with the amount of people surging into the area. And unbeknownst to them, as everyone's pouring their lifeblood into the city, in 1893, the financial collapse is going to hit the country, and hard times are going to descend upon Tacoma. And we really depended on a lot of boosters at that time. But I think perhaps one of the largest is actually the blue collar workers of Tacoma. In the 1880s through the 1890s, during that rough financial period there, it was the longshore workers of Tacoma who established the first unions in Washington Territory before statehood in 1888. These guys were down there organizing with the Knights of Labor, fighting for higher wages, shorter hours, better conditions. And when they won their labor negotiations, they put the Port of Tacoma area, not yet Port of Tacoma, not until 1918, but that port culture of Tacoma really firmly in the mind of major players and economic development, helping the city survive that big financial collapse, right? I'm going to check our comments here really quick. And it's allowed the city to get to the point where in 1912, when legislation changes and people are like, we should have a port, a lot of discussion went on about it. But here's the problem in 1912. The measure to establish an official Port of Tacoma gets slapped down because farmers in rural Pierce County don't think it's going to benefit them. They're going to have to pay to have this official port established out there. And they're like, what's in it for us? So some years go by, and in 1918, the powers that be wooed the people, and they're like, listen, I know it seems like we might not be connected, but in fact, this is the most important thing for you. And the big selling point was a cold storage facility, because farmers in rural agricultural Pierce County were losing a lot of profit by not being able to long-term store their products. So by having this cold storage facility where agricultural products can be stored for the long term as part of the port down there, people are like, okay, all right, I'm interested. And so in 1918, it's officially established that there's going to be a Port of Tacoma. And one of the guys who's responsible for this is a big time favorite of Pretty Gritty Tours and Foss Waterway Seaport, Chester Thorne. You may know him as eccentric millionaire and shrewd banker who survives the Great Depression with aplomb. And of course, the owner of Thornwood Castle. Chester Thorne, along with longshore worker and official Edward Kloss, and then of course, Sumner farmer Charles Orton, become the 3 first port commissioners. And what's important about port commissioners is that they are elected. And I think you see the trident of power with these guys. You have a rich Tacoma banker and Tacoma booster, Chester Thorne. You have a knowledgeable blue-collar longshore official, Edward Kloss. And then you have the agricultural roots with the farmer, Charles Orton, out in Sumner, right? And they together become the first port commissioners and really establish the direction of what the Port of Tacoma is going to look like. And to give you a little snippet of that, we actually have from Port of Tacoma this brief clip. And I'm very excited for you guys to see this because if nothing else, it has some of the most delicious footage of boomtown Tacoma, past that sort of like 1880s boom to the point where Tacoma is picking itself back up and being like, listen, the rest of the world isn't going to help us. We are going to have to literally and figuratively build ourselves. And the best way to do that is with a port. So please enjoy.
The story of the Port of Tacoma goes beyond ships, cranes, and cargo. Its journey, set forth by the residents of Pierce County, begins in 1918, a year of destiny. While the Great War continued, people on the home front were gearing up for a new era.
The people were public conscious, desirous of having the city build its own light and power system, trolley line, that sort of thing. So they were not averse to government getting involved in creating business opportunities. And the community was pretty much united in its great desire to be a major city.
As we get close to when the citizens decide to create this Port Authority, 1918, just as you kind of move to that decision point, things are really happening in the city. Big time things were happening.
The Pantages and Rialto theaters lit up Tacoma's entertainment scene. Camp Lewis expanded to support the war efforts, and the Kiwanis Club chartered its first Northwest Club.
So there's a lot of things that were going on that were precursors to the big decision by the countywide voters to create the Port Authority. The table was set.
With a $2.5 million bond issue, Sumner farmer Charles Orton, longshoreman Edward Kloss, and banker Chester Thorne directed the port's purchase of 240 acres of land on the tide flats and the construction of 3 piers and a monorail system. Tacoma's longshore workers developed a reputation for hard work and independent thought.
Cargo was handled with your hands. Machines did some of the work, but mostly you touched it with your hands and you put it in place.
We were the first port and labor to travel together to meet with customers. One of the things that attracted customers, and with customers came cargo, and with that came jobs, is the labor force that worked together with the port management in keeping a Tacoma advantage.
Port of Tacoma has always been ready to take on the cargo that's coming down the road. They're not averse to change or to tackling what has to be done.
100 years on, and we are proud of our legacy of creating environmentally responsible economic opportunities for the residents of Pierce County.
We call it the economic engine, and that really is what it is. It's the fuel to keep the engine going. And that fuel consists of people, it consists of ideas, of equipment, of infrastructure. The port is always a changing and growing entity.
Washington State is the most trade-dependent state in America, and so many hundreds of thousands of jobs depend on trade in our state. We make great products, grow great food, provide a lot of services that are highly valued and in great demand all around the world. And our ports, including the Port of Tacoma, play a critical role in those job creation activities, supporting good-paying jobs, family wage jobs in the state of Washington.
When voters approved the Port of Tacoma, they anchored our region's economy and charted the course for the opportunities we now enjoy. Likewise, the seeds we plant today will determine the successes that our grandchildren and their children will enjoy in the century to come.
So I love that. I think it's a very good recap of it. And what I really want you to bear in mind through this whole thing is the connectivity of Port of Tacoma and how it has fueled everything. The proximity of Joint Base Lewis McChord and the military involvement in the city of Tacoma is on the same sort of token as that. Fort Lewis, of course, being a bond-issued plot of land that gave the military the foothold and training center that we have today, is just dependent. Like, everything links up to one another. And I think one of the best examples of that is Almond Roca. Almond Roca, if you're not familiar, was created by candy makers and philanthropists Brown and Haley back in the early 1900s. And Almond Roca continues to be produced here in the city of Tacoma and shipped globally. They're still in their original factory. And one of the reasons that they were able to have this candy empire is because, A, the Port of Tacoma allowed easy and affordable shipping of exotic materials like sugar and cocoa into the city, allowing them to keep production costs down. The military with Fort Lewis finds a connection with the ability to ship troops out on various encounters from the Port of Tacoma, or to bring in heavy machinery here for training on Fort Lewis. And they develop a relationship with Almond Roca to supply candy to the military. And during the sugar crisis and sugar ration of the 1940s, they maintain their government contract because they're close to the Port of and supplying candy to the troops at Fort Lewis. It's like Port of Tacoma is the keystone, and so much of our history that you might think is unconnected is all interwoven into this fabric. The coming and going, the import and the export is the lifeblood of this city coming through the beating heart, our port. So now you can understand just how important it is that when in 1919, the voters approved this draft right here from Frank Walsh, who creates the sort of initial plan of Port of Tacoma, why this is so huge. And then it's just 1 year later that the first ship comes in, the Edmore, and that's the first official ship to call Port of Tacoma its home for a moment. And you can see, of course, flour is a big export from the area. It continues to be, grain rather, is the #1 export through the Port of Tacoma today. And it's always been important here. Now, key responsibilities for Port of Tacoma include handling 80% of all trade to Alaska, as I mentioned, and being the main facilitator of trade from Hawaii, actually. All of our Pacific-oriented state brethren, sisters are connected through this gateway, this door into the rest of the United States. Tacoma is that front door to basically all of the other 48 states out there, because you can ship everything via train. And that was established early on with Tacoma as the terminus. And so while it looks like things have definitely modernized, adapted, and changed, they're still built on that original foundation. when you're looking at the port today, you can see just how dramatically it has changed, though, and you can see how incredible the scope is of what comes in here, from buses to tractors. I actually have a clip of this. You can see the width and the scope of these John Deere tractors coming off of this massive ship here, being brought into Port of Tacoma and then shipped outwards around the United States from here, or vice versa, onto a ship and then out globally. Here's another one. It's not just volume of cargo that comes out of Port of Tacoma, but the actual size of the cargo itself is impressive, including military equipment. One of the big reasons that Port of Tacoma maintained its foothold here was because it was a big player with our military here with Fort Lewis, and continues today to be the checkpoint in which all of this cargo comes in. But bringing cargo on and off a ship is really a key part of this story. So when you're looking at Port of Tacoma today, it really enters the container era in the 1970s. And one of the things that we're going to talk about, or will come up if you're hearing about the port, is TEU. And that should be something that you should just have in your lexicon as a Tacoma person, if you are. It stands for 20-foot equivalent unit. And when you're thinking about port history, envision the time before the container that you would have to do everything by hand, right? You see the old historic photos of like the Foss Seaport, for example. You would have to take grains, like sacks of grain, and move them manually onto one of those little carts, essentially, and then bring it onto a ship by hand. Revolutionizing the world was the 20-foot equivalent unit, or the TEU. It's essentially the 20-foot standard shipping container, and that you could load that up with anything, and then the container can then be moved around. So this becomes later intermodal, or taking something from one mode of transportation to another. For example, ship to train to truck. And so instead of having to take everything out piece by piece and transferring it to a new container like on the back of a truck, you could just pick up the container and move it from one section to another. And there's actually a really good look at sort of intermodal transportation right here.
You have probably seen giant ships carrying containers travel in and out of Commencement Bay, and you may have seen these containers traveling on trains along Tacoma's waterfront or on trucks on Interstate 5. But have you ever wondered, how did the containers get off the ship and onto these trains and trucks? It all depends on machines such as container cranes and straddle carriers. These monster machines are operated by Tacoma's longshore workers. Let's take a look at how an imported container makes it from the ship to a rail car. It involves monster machines, skilled longshore, and a great amount of teamwork and coordination. And it all starts with the container crane. Once the container is placed on the dock, a straddle carrier picks up the container and then can load it in the rail yard near the terminal. This is where the container is transferred to a rail car. This rail yard is called an intermodal yard. Once the container leaves the yard, the train can have it to Chicago in 66 hours and New York in 100 hours. Containers that are headed to locations in Puget Sound are usually picked up and delivered by truck. The container can be lifted onto a truck chassis by a straddle carrier or a side loader. Once the container is secured and all the paperwork is in order, the truck driver leaves the terminal with the container. Eventually, the contents of that container might end up on the shelves of the stores such as Fred Meyer, Target, Home Depot. And while the huge container ships played a key role in getting that cargo from Tokyo or Shanghai to Tacoma, the port's monster machines play a key role in getting the container from the ship to the shore and, finally, to the store.
Ship to shore to store is a phrase that I need to incorporate more in my daily life just because it sounds so sweet. So while intermodal methods of transportation have now revolutionized not only the way that we do a lot of shipping, but specifically Port of Tacoma, it was not always the case, as you can see here. So this is back in 1921 in September, and this was the creme of the creme. This was cream of the crop back in the day because it was tall enough that a freight train could go underneath it. So they were still working on taking lumber directly off the train, putting it onto the ship, but they hadn't devised that container system yet. They were a long ways out from that. Today, you can see basically the three ways that intermodal work, and all of them are connected to Tacoma. But it is our ability to have those freight trains come in and out that makes it so incredible. And city of Tacoma is really spectacular in that it is the only city I know of where there is a fleet of engines that's part of the public utilities for the city, I believe. So if you're downtown Tacoma and you see the red and white engines, those are City of Tacoma, Port of Tacoma specific trains that operate on helping to move that cargo around. And then it can go out. I think our biggest trains that you see in the area are probably the BNSF orange trains, with a few of the Union Pacifics making the rounds through here. But those are City of Tacoma trains. Now, here's a quick snapshot of how it went. You would have to take it on these little tractors. In fact, I believe this tractor is still down at the Foss Waterway Seaport. So if you want to actually get some close proximity look at the way that shipping used to be done, you can do it right down there. And then in the 1920s, they established this system, creating a pier far enough out onto the water that you can ship something directly. You can see the trains on the right there, to a storage facility that has the ceiling mounted cranes up there that can transport cargo to the other side of the facility onto the pier, where the steam crane up aloft there can then place it onto the ship. So a few more steps involved than what you have today, where the carriers can now pick up a container right off of these transit lines here and then take it anywhere else that it needs to go. And the cranes have definitely changed. While they used to look like this, you're probably familiar now with the super cranes that are here in the city of Tacoma. And those have just changed, I mean, everything, allowing the Port of Tacoma to deal with larger ships and larger quantities of freight. But I want to give you guys a quick snapshot here of how the Port of Tacoma has physically changed. And what you'll see here, we're going to start in 2018 with the aerial shot here, and then work our way backwards. All of these are available if you want to take closer looks at them on the City of Tacoma Maps webpage. I'll put the link up to that later and you can pour through them. Fascinating info. But you can look here. So now we're in the 1990s. Then we're going back into 1970, and you can see how the area has really been terraformed, and these waterways have been dredged, widened, expanded, creating more opportunities for shipping. Here, this one's important because if you see that waterway at the very top there, you can still see the bridge extending over that there, the Blair Waterway. This is I think possibly the 1940s or 1950s. This is 1940s. And then, of course, our earliest one I have here is 1933. And this is a period of great transformation, Port of Tacoma, because you went from this major economic center, and then the Great Depression hits. And it's right when the port opens their cold storage facility to help the farmers. They've finally got everything set up there. And so they need a rebirth. And in 1939, industrial development becomes the thing. So you see a ton of development early on with businesses coming to Tacoma, right? You have a lot of these major shippers of lumber and grain export. A lot is coming out, and then a lot is coming in to the Port of Tacoma as well. And the Great Depression changes so much of that. You might have seen some of the historic photos of the tide flats in the 1930s, because you can see a lot of that was still pretty much tide flat area, undeveloped. And there was a large homeless center that was down there for a period of time that eventually they reclaimed. The U.S. Coast Guardsmen and firefighters come through and do a controlled burn of that whole area down there, and then it becomes an expansion of Port of Tacoma down there. And the Tacoma Waterfront Defense Committee, with the port and a lot of the sort of gearing up of industrial centers down there, were responsible for that, turning it into a much larger port center. So this is in 1931 here, and you can see that more industrial centers start coming down there, which is a turning point there. And an important distinction I think you need to make is that while Port of Tacoma managed a lot of that area down there, they don't control all 5,000 acres. And so independent businesses have been down on the tide flats in that port area, but not under the jurisdiction of Port of Tacoma. And so Port of Tacoma has maintained stewardship and I guess responsibility for several parts of that area, but not the whole thing. And I really think that's an important distinction when you're looking at the history of the area there. Grain terminals become a big part of that here. And so this one is United Grain Terminal. It's one of the oldest grain silos that I could find. And it was revolutionary because if you've seen those grain sacks from those early photos there, to be able to stop transporting grain bags by hand from, railway to ship, and then to actually be able to store it long-term in a grain silo here and then dispense it either onto a track or onto a ship, changes so much and starts to really change the landscape here, where in 1954 is what you're looking at here with, of course, Mount Rainier in the background there. You see how a lot of this has changed. When I was talking about the importance of the connectivity of the area, we have to talk about the military, because Works Protection Act changes a lot of the area. The strength of labor unions really keeps the Port of Tacoma as a functioning operation through the Great Depression. And then at the dawn of World War II, for U.S. involvement in that, the military really starts to fill all of the port operations down there. And while, of course, import and export is still happening, really the focus becomes on domestic production of a lot, including ships. Several different class of ships were built here in Tacoma, not the least of which were wooden-hulled minesweepers. And these ships were important because they were non-magnetic. And so you see a transition of the port from massive storage, as well as cold storage for agricultural products and fishing fleets, now to production of ships like this. So this is MS-114. This ship was built later on in the 1960s, but was a sort of legacy ship that comes through after those minesweepers are first established here in the Port of Tacoma. And when we enter World War II, basically from 1942 to 1945, troops are training out at Fort Lewis, then being deployed out to the Pacific Theater from the Port of Tacoma and outwards. And then supply ships are going out from here to take care of the various military outposts around. And the mechanized docks, the cranes, become so influential and powerful to supporting that war effort. And they become symbiotic, where the U.S. military now starts developing infrastructure that will then later be used by Port of Tacoma. So they have this relationship where they feed each other throughout that wartime effort. And I've got a picture here because one of the big things that was going on down here is, of course, ship production. So this is the Cape Alva. It was a freight motor ship and was the first vessel to be launched by the Seattle-Tacoma Shipbuilding Corporation from its Tacoma site right down here. And the Todd shipyards are the major producer of ships down there. And there's, not surprisingly, a sort of a lack of historic photographs of those ships actually in production. Makes perfect sense, of course. But this is one of the few that I could find of when the Tacoma boat building plant was presented with an E award, capital letter E, by the Army and Navy. And the E award was a production award and was the shipyard's award that was given to them for the production of those minesweepers that they had out there. And each of them got like a little pin. Everyone who worked in the port had a little E pin that they could wear with pride. And then minesweepers like this one here, which I'm trying to remember was a YMS 241. There it is right on the front. Was part of the massive war effort of ships that were coming out here. So, trying to give you guys the best picture I can here. Independent businesses becomes Port of Tacoma. Massive industrial development blossoms, crushed by the Great Depression, but everyone is buoyed again. And now there's a war production that goes on down there. And this is basically the theme again and again. Every time there is a nationwide collapse or depression from 1893 or the 1930s, the people of Tacoma rally together. And that is the story of Port of Tacoma, because it was created by the people, for the people, and is, run by the people with its proud legacy of labor unions, its elected port commissioners. This is not some mysterious partner in the shadows. The Port of Tacoma is us, and it has maintained that strong lifeblood of power and connectivity to the area. And I'm very proud of that. So looking through the production here, this is one of my favorites. This is of the Todd shipyard out there. To give you an idea here, it was right out there, very close to Northeast Tacoma, in that red section there on the end of the spit of the land, just south of what is now the Blair Waterway. And then, of course, you can see the massive ships that were leaving here. But of course, after wartime production fades in the 1940s, there's this another sort of power vacuum, and port commissioners look to really develop more maritime trade because it diminishes, like 90% disappears at the end of World War II. And so they start to try and bring in manufacturers. This becomes the new chapter for Port of Tacoma. So it's trying to build a reputation as an industrial port, getting these businesses to set up manufacturing facilities down in the tide flats and, sweetening the deal. Be like, hey, if you produce what you make right down here, you can ship it globally right next door. You just put it on a track and send it outwards, and we can facilitate that. And people love it. They're all about it. So a lot of industrial production shows up now on the tide flats at the conclusion of World War II through the 1950s and 60s, and becomes the main sort of driving pulse that leads to Port of Tacoma shipping in and out. Grain continues to be a major export through the area, but now we see a huge influx and outflux of different industrial items, including, I think one of the most famous is Kaiser Aluminum, which was a natural transition. Kaiser Aluminum, the aluminum facility was there for World War II. Kaiser purchases it, expands its aluminum plant on the east side of the Blair Waterway, and then starts this massive production out there. And one of the most famous parts of it is the 500-foot smokestack, which was completed in 1968. And then the Alumadomes, as I've heard them called, or the first Tacoma Dome. We get the Tacoma Dome in 1983. For those of you into trivia, it is now the world's second largest wooden dome. But these two domes, the Kaiser domes, were down there and used to store aluminum ore before it was processed into refined aluminum. And these were down in the Port of Tacoma area for years. Eventually, after Kaiser halts its aluminum production down there, you see sort of this fading of major, I guess, industrial production down there. Kaiser wasn't the only one. Here's the dome coming down here. Hooker Chemical was another one of the famous ones down there. You've probably, if you've done any of our tours previously, seen this building right back here, past the salt steeple there. This was the Hooker Chemical Depot, and they really relied heavily on the connection to the train, being able to bring in chemicals, produce them, and then ship them outwards around the world from here. Also, Pennsylvania Salt was down on the tide flats near Port of Tacoma for a long period of time. And all of these were creating a tremendous amount of jobs and export and revenue for the area, but they left behind quite a bit of legacy pollution. And Port of Tacoma steps up and cleans up a lot of that. As they acquire those properties that used to be privately owned, for example, by Kaiser, they start to clean them up and start remediation processes to turn those into either wetlands, wildlife refuges, or areas that are now going to be used as part of Port of Tacoma. So it was in 1955, the first time a firm recommended widening the Foss Waterway and the Blair Waterways, which you can see on the map here. And this starts to expand Port of Tacoma even more, which takes us to perhaps what makes Port of Tacoma so intrinsically and uniquely valuable right now, is that large ships start coming in. In 76, the first tote ship, Tote Marine, which I assume most of you are familiar with, comes to Tacoma and calls it home here. And this was one of the biggest ships to come in at that time. Tote primarily operates between the lower 48 and Alaska. So this is where the Gateway to Alaska theme starts coming in, but they're not alone. Evergreen is a major shipping that comes through here. And so the port's yearly container volume finally tops 1 million for the first time in 1991. And it's because these massive ships are coming in. So Evergreen here is out of Taiwan, and it moved its northwest terminal from Seattle to Tacoma in 91 and starts this major production of, or I guess major influx of cargo coming now through Port of Tacoma here. And it's because Port of Tacoma has the infrastructure to handle it. Same time, they're developing, I'm waiting for everyone to guess here, what is our biggest export? I've given it away a couple times. Grain, specifically soy, out of the Midwest. Facilities like the grain terminals that you might have seen down on Schuster Parkway here. This was a port project from the 1970s. And this is specifically designed to handle the massive amounts of soybean and corn coming through the area, right? So now you draw back, you look at Port of Tacoma. It has deep waterways. It has cranes large enough to handle the ships and the containers coming in. It has an intermodal system that allows you to save not just cost on your product, import and export, but also reduce your carbon footprint, because you can save so much time, effort, and actually industrial usage, bringing something right off of the ship, putting it onto a train or a truck and shipping it outwards. But also all of this grain is now being massively upscaled and sent outwards. And there's only one serious problem at the time. And it was, ironically, the thing that was saving the area in the 1950s. When Port of Tacoma was look at the picture here. Port of Tacoma is basically right in between Main Tacoma and Northeast Tacoma. And so the Blair Bridge was a construction project in the 1950s. And it connected the city of Tacoma to our distant friend, Northeast Tacoma out there, allowing easy transport back and forth between the two. It also has a huge sort of lift gate. It's a double drawbridge there. And I think it was like 153 feet that it could expand open to. So you can bring ships in. Like this one here, These are actually ships, aircraft carriers from World War II, and you could send them out through the bridge. So it becomes the great connection to the area, pictured here, Blair Bridge. And eventually, this now becomes a chokehold, sadly. So when the Blair Bridge is like revolutionary at the time, as years go by, it becomes too small for the ships coming in the area. I want to see if I've got the slide for you guys here. As ships are trying to get out, it gets pretty tight. I don't know if I have it loaded up, but it becomes the point where the ships are getting so much larger. The Blair Bridge is still so small that ships are getting stuck, and this is a double problem. Now your shipping traffic slows way down, and your traffic in and out of Tacoma from northeast Tacoma to central Tacoma is disrupted. And so there's a great deal of conversation about what to do about this whole thing. And the decision is made that there needs to be a separate freeway that connects to the city. And if you are in the area now, you're familiar with our Cable Street Bridge, and this opens in the 90s, and then in 1997, right after the completion of the Cable Street Bridge and all of Highway 507, the Blair Bridge is removed, knocked down, and that Blair Waterway is significantly expanded, developed, and deepened with the Port of Tacoma and actually the Puyallup tribe, allowing now for larger ships to come in. So if you're looking at this, like I said, in 91 is when we top our 1 million containers in a year. And this is because we can now expand out into the waterway. So if you think this one at the top here, the 98 Regina Maris comes through, that's 6,000 of those 20-foot units, basically. It is the largest container ship to call into North America. And then it's just completely blown out of the water in 2016 when the Benjamin Franklin comes to Port of Tacoma and has an 18,000 TEU capacity there. So the massive ships now arriving to the area is unprecedented. So here it is, 1987, the Port of Tacoma breaks a world record by receiving this ship here, and the intermodal rail now takes off, I believe, 937 containers in a single 8-hour shift. And it's staggering for so many reasons, but it sets Port of Tacoma now on a global stage, making us, I believe today, the 5th largest container gateway in North America. And I keep saying the alliance because today, while they had a long history of competition, Port of Seattle and Port of Tacoma merged together to have the Northwest Seaport Alliance. And while they are still separate ports with their own commissioners, their own executive director, they work together with a single CEO to facilitate in a lot of ways as a single port, even though, yes, they are separate ports. And that allows for even more development. So to give you a side-by-side comparison here, this is where we're at currently. In 2004, those of you who are around probably remember when the super cranes came in, and the super cranes, taller than Godzilla, just slightly shorter than the Space Needle, were brought in as fully constructed units on a ship whose job was just to bring them across the ocean. I don't remember if I have the clip of this, but it was amazing when they came in, because these cranes here at the back, 4 of them come across the Pacific Ocean, all built just on this container ship that brings them in, and like rolled in the fog. It was an amazing thing to see back in 2004. And this really just changes the way that Port of Tacoma can do business. And now you can take deeper draft ships that have larger TEU capacity. And because you've got your intermodal system, onwards and upwards from there. I believe I've got, yeah, I'll bring it up here in a second, but you can see just how much comes in and out. One of the biggest things that we also import to the area are cars. And you can take a look. The development of the auto facility here, the auto warehousing company, allows for all of these automobiles to be brought in on ships, offloaded to this center here, and then dispersed throughout the area. They can be brought on to trains from here or just driven to any of the auto body shops in the area here. Not auto body shops, but auto dealerships. And so you could see, I mean, it's staggering to see the development from a small 1918 port where people are loading things by hand to now the Port of Tacoma as it is, bringing in just tremendous amounts of cargo on these systems. And so when you look at that system there, it's amazing. But one of the things that Port of Tacoma has been most passionate about is the preservation and the cleaning of the area. So this is that 500-foot stack, right, from the Kaiser plant that we were talking about. And in 2006, it was demolished with plans for developing the port beyond that. And one of the big development plans for Port of Tacoma has always been remediation, or taking these sites that have legacy pollution and cleaning them, removing that pollution, and then developing that site to be used for something else. So you can see this is part of the Port of Tacoma map that you can take a look at there. Areas that are awaiting cleanup, ones that have already been cleaned up, and ones that are sort of in the middle zone right now. And this was part of a big movement in the Tacoma area. One of the things that really changed the city of Tacoma was, of course, the Superfund cleanup of the Foss Waterway, and Port of Tacoma was doing this for their waterways as well. And so today, when you're looking at the waterways down there, there are quite a few places that have been remediated and cleaned and returned to wetlands or wildlife refuges. So on Port of Tacoma, you can actually get an interactive map of the places that you can visit. The orange ones here are remediated sites that are not open to the public, but the green ones are remediated sites that you can go visit. And a big one is right off Marine View Drive here. This was a joint venture with the Puyallup tribe, and they took a gravel mine and inert waste landfill site, essentially in 2011, and then turned it into a habitat. They cleaned it and restored it and created this migratory wetland, which is now a bird sanctuary. It is the place where fish return. It has native shrubs and trees, and also works as an interpretive center so that people can get to know the area a little better. And I actually have a really good one here for you guys about one of the projects that the Port of Tacoma does about returning marine nutrients to the area. So take a look.
We are distributing several hundred carcasses of freshly spawned out chum salmon throughout the mitigation site to provide marine nutrients to put back into the system.
It's common all over the Northwest, yes. It's just the first time the port's set up a team to do this, and the first time we've gotten some fish from the tribe.
40, 50 yards this way on the north side, throwing them in. I've just been putting them on the bank.
There's some direct benefits to carnivores and scavengers, but most of the benefits are indirect in that as the carcasses decompose, they provide nutrients for all the species. They help the plants grow, which then bugs and small critters eat the plants, and then bigger critters eat the smaller critters and the bugs, and then bigger critters eat the bigger critters that eat the bugs and the plants, etc., etc., etc.
This morning they were alive.
We are aiming for the water. We are also aiming just along the banks of the water. So as salmon naturally spawn out and they die, sometimes they end up on the bank and sometimes they stay in the water. So we're trying to mimic that natural process.
It's the environmental team. It's out here for a little afternoon of chum chucking.
What other way would you want to spend a Friday?
Chum are a lot of fun to chuck.
The critters are going to be super happy. It's like Christmas.
Chum chucking. Such a valuable and often unheard of part of the remediation process and creating a healthy environment. Port of Tacoma does so much more than just import and export that I don't think people really know about. And the environmental impact and cleanup is a huge one of them. They invest millions of dollars in creating a sustainable and healthy environment down here. And here's a quick list of a lot of the stuff they do, but managing stormwater pipes is a huge part of that. Street sweeping is a significant portion of keeping that everything designed. Stormwater treatment is a big part of what Port of Tacoma does, and also information and education about downspout boxes, which if you don't have one, I strongly recommend, because quite a lot of contaminants can run off of your roof down through the gutter, and a simple downspout box can filter out a lot of those heavy metals and contaminants from your roof. And this is what's so important, and part of the big picture of Port of Tacoma that they're working at tirelessly, is that if you think of the South Sound like a giant pan, right? Every time we do anything out there, a lot of that flows then via rainfall, which we usually have a lot of, into Commencement Bay and can contaminate our ecosystem significantly. And so Port of Tacoma doesn't just focus on remediation of the water sites and cleaning up legacy pollution from industrial centers that were down actually on the tide flats, but proactively working to make sure that less contaminants flow into the water, but also taking care of legacy pollution in around. For example, the stormwater pipes can have pollution in them from the 1960s. If something like the Asarco plant puts arsenic into the air and it lands on the street and then flows into a storm drain, that can cling inside the pipe. And then when it rains in 2020, that can flow down out of that storm drain out into the water. And so Port of Tacoma is proactively going and essentially cleaning out those storm pipes and then scooping up that sediment and removing it from the equation altogether so that it no longer flows out there. So putting good stuff like chum back into the environment, extracting the bad stuff from the environment is remediation, and it is a huge core value to the Port of Tacoma. So that's why we have places like the Palace of Circling Waters here, which, fun fact, for those of you with kids or childlike spirits, you can actually download the Wetland Bird Bingo or Native Plant Bingo and kill several hours out hunting for endemic flora and fauna out there. And this is a good snapshot of industrial, non-Port of Tacoma owned industry that was down there, and then what has been changed into a lot of these green operations. So always the beating heart of economy and commerce in the area with an eye to a brighter future. What better way to live in the area? Port of Tacoma, the unsung hero. And like I said, every tour that we've ever done is in some way connected to Port of Tacoma. The businesses that we've had here, the reason that Tacoma was the terminus, the legacy, the history, the movement of this area, from the Foss Waterway Seaport to Thornwood Castle. The reason we have what we have is literally because it probably came through Port of Tacoma, but also because like the candle, for all of us, it draws us through the dark to this spot and has called us all to probably call this place home. If you're like me, it's the reason I'm here. So thank you, I think, at the end of the day, for joining me on this exploration of one of the most mysterious parts of Tacoma, which it really shouldn't be. Now, I can't encourage you enough to go to the Port of Tacoma website. They have so many incredible resources, not just about their history, but also they have a virtual tour that they do there. So if you want to look at those individual sites, you can do that. Also, going down to Port of Tacoma to their observation platform is a treat for not just kids, but adults, because they have a like 3-story viewing platform down there where you can watch that intermodal system in action. The ships actually basically come right up bow to the observation platform, and you can watch cargo coming on and off. And it's really extraordinary. I think it's difficult to comprehend the size and scope of what goes on down there, but it's one of the biggest ports in the country, and it handles, billions of dollars worth of revenue for the state. It is the reason we're here, and having the opportunity to go down and check it out is awesome. And I don't think they're doing it right now, but I know that they do frequently do it. The bus tours that they lead through Port of Tacoma are really extraordinary, and I highly recommend you checking them out. So thanks, guys. I hope you have a fantastic evening. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments below. I believe the Foss Waterway Seaport is monitoring as well, and I hope that Port of Tacoma will chime in on a few of those comments as well. They have a really fantastic communications team and seem always ready to answer any of the questions that we have. So until next time, my friends, keep on exploring. I'll see you soon.